Good evening, my friend. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it where you are? Here in this quiet hour, I invite you to rest and travel back with me through memory. Settle in and let the gentle cadence of my voice carry you. My name is Frederick Douglass, and tonight I will share with you the journey of my life. A life that began in darkness and bondage, and rose into light and freedom. As I speak in these soft tones, imagine the scenes of long ago. The dim candlelight of a log cabin, the whisper of the night wind over the Maryland fields, the distant chirr of crickets. I will tell you of sorrow and hope, of cruelty and triumph, all in a slow, peaceful rhythm. Let your eyes grow heavy as we begin, and drift with me to the start of my story in the year 1818, on a plantation by the Chesapeake Bay. I was born in Talbot County, Maryland, in a place called Tuckahoe. I wish I could tell you the exact date, but I was never given that privilege. The enslaved children where I grew up knew as little of their birthdays as the horses in the stable. I remember as a small boy feeling a quiet ache, not knowing my age, while white children would proudly announce theirs. Such was the design of slavery, to keep us ignorant of even the simplest facts of our lives. I was a child of mixed heritage, my father a white man, very possibly the master of the plantation. My mother, an enslaved black woman named Harriet Bailey. In those days, it was common for a slaveholder to father children with women he enslaved, then cruelly deny his own offspring. I was separated from my mother in infancy, as was the custom on that plantation. I never saw her face by daylight. Only a handful of times, in the dead of night, did I feel her presence. She would steal away after dark, walking 12 miles from a neighboring farm, just to lie beside me until I fell asleep. I recall the warmth of her arms around me in the pre-dawn hush, how she hummed a lullaby so softly. By the time the roosters crowed, she would be gone, slipping back through the woods to be in the field by sunrise, lest she be whipped for absence. Her visits were brief, precious, and few. When I was around 7 years old, I was told that my mother had passed away. They hadn't allowed me to be with her during her illness or at her burial. The news of her death felt strangely distant. Having never truly known her, I received it with the same emotion I might have felt at the loss of a stranger. It pains me now to say that. The separation between mother and child had dulled the natural affection, just as it was meant to do. Even so, in quiet moments, I would imagine her face and wonder if I had her eyes. In dreams, I sometimes felt her gentle hand smoothing my hair. These are the fragile threads of memory I hold close, in a childhood otherwise filled with hardship. After my mother's passing, I lived for a time with my loving grandmother, Betsy, in a small cabin on the edge of a large plantation. Those early years had moments of peace. Grandmama Betsy was responsible for caring for the young ones, and she protected me as best she could from the harshness of the world around us. I was a lively child, curious about everything. Sometimes I chased butterflies through the tall grass or watched the sunlight shimmer on the Chesapeake waters beyond the fields. Yet even in those innocent days, I began to see the shadows that surrounded us. One of my earliest memories, one that still lingers in my dreams, is of my Aunt Hester. She was about 17, not much older than a girl, beautiful and proud. Our master, Captain Aaron Anthony, whom we called Old Master, had taken a troubling interest in her. One night, Aunt Hester disobeyed his orders and went out, perhaps to see a young man she cared for. When old master found out, his anger was terrible and loud. I was around 6 years old, playing quietly on the kitchen floor in the dim morning light. When I heard Aunt Hester cry out, my small body froze with fear. Through a crack in the door, I saw confusion and shouting, the heavy weight of authority and punishment filling the air. I didn't understand what I was seeing, but I felt the fear and sorrow of that moment deep within me. It was then that I first sensed how fragile and unfair the world could be. Her skin shone in the low light, and I remember the glint of the cowhide whip in his hand. Now you ha, he snarled. I'll teach you to disobey me. What followed is a scene seared into my soul. The whip whistled through the air and struck her flesh again and again. Hester's cries were heart-rending, desperate. She pleaded for mercy that would not come. Blood trickled down her back, each new lash opening fresh wounds. Have mercy, please, she begged. But the master's heart was iron. The louder she screamed, the harder he whipped. I had never seen such brutality. Terrified, I hid in a closet, pressing my hands over my ears to muffle her screams. But I could still hear them, those awful screams at dawn, echoing through the chambers of my young mind. Eventually, the whipping ended. Aunt Hester was untied and collapsed, sobbing, her back streaked with blood. Old Master stormed out, leaving a horrid silence behind. I crept out and saw her there, trembling and hurt, and I could do nothing to help. I was just a child, helpless. That morning, as the sun rose pale and cold, I understood for the first time the hell of slavery into which I had been cast. It was the blood-stained gate, I would later write, the entrance to the hell of slavery, through which I was about to pass. My childhood innocence was gone from that moment. No lullabies or gentle grandmother's love could shield me from the reality that I, like Aunt Hester, was considered nothing more than someone's property, to be used and abused at a whim. I recount these grim memories calmly now, in the safe distance of time, but I will never forget how they felt. The sights, sounds, and even the metallic smell of that morning remain vivid. Yet, dear listener, do not be alarmed. Stay with me. As night deepens, I will guide you through these dark passages with a steady voice. In the years that followed, I witnessed more acts of cruelty on that plantation. I saw men and women lashed for the smallest infractions. Saw a slave named Demby shot dead by an overseer for refusing a beating. I heard the soul-wrenching songs of my fellow slaves echo across the swamps at dusk. Melancholy hymns filled with sighs and tears, which would make your heart ache even if you didn't understand the words. Sometimes, late at night, I would creep to the door of our little cabin and look up at the vast sky spangled with stars. In those stars, I tried to find some comfort, imagining that beyond them, a divine justice might be watching. Often, I felt a longing I could not name, a hope that flickered like a faint candle in the oppressive darkness. One day, that hope took shape in the form of a summons. I was told I would be leaving the plantation. Leaving. The thought made my heart pound, not with fear, but with a strange excitement. You see, a rumor had spread among us that I was to be sent to live in Baltimore, to serve a new master's family. To an enslaved child on the Eastern Shore, being sent to the city felt like being beckoned into a brighter world. Baltimore. We imagined its streets meant better food, less grueling labor, and relative liberty compared to the plantation. I knew slaves who sang wistfully about going to Baltimore. For once, fortune seemed to smile on me. And so it was that, one day, I left behind the only life I'd known. My grandmother Betsy walked me to the big house. I was about 8 years old, clutching a little bundle of clothes. I didn't understand that Grandmama was saying goodbye for the last time. She had been tasked to deliver me to my new owners, and once she left me there, she slipped away quietly, returning alone to her cabin many miles off. I looked around and realized I was truly alone among strangers. My grandmother was gone. That moment, I felt an awful hollowness, an orphaned feeling that sank in my chest like a stone. But a carriage soon took me to the port, and I was placed aboard a ship bound for Baltimore. The vessel's timber deck throbbed under my feet as the wind filled the sails. As the shoreline receded, I whispered a soft prayer learned from my grandmother. "Oh Lord, watch over your child." I had no idea what lay ahead, but anything seemed better than the blood-stained fields I was leaving. The journey took only a day or two. When I arrived in Baltimore, 1826 by the calendar, I was led up from the bustling wharf into streets alive with activity. The city's air smelled of salt water and coal smoke instead of the plantation's sweat and soil. Horse hooves clattered on cobblestone. Vendors called out their wares. And, how shall I describe it? There was a different feeling here. In Baltimore, I saw black people walking about, unshackled, decently dressed, even conducting business. A city slave, I soon learned, was almost a freeman compared to one on a farm. I was brought to the home of Hugh and Sophia Auld, relatives of my old master. They lived in a brick house on Alisana Street. Mistress Sophia greeted me with a gentle smile, a look almost maternal. I could hardly believe a white woman was addressing me kindly and not barking orders. She had never owned a slave before, and, in her innocence, treated me at first not as chattel, but as a curious child. I became the houseboy, attending their little son Thomas. Those first days in Baltimore I remember as if bathed in a softer light. No one whipped me. I had enough to eat. I slept in a comfortable nook. And my new mistress, bless her, did something that changed the course of my life. She began to teach me my letters. I recall an afternoon by the window, golden sunbeams filtering through, as Mrs. Auld pointed to the alphabet in an old book. "This is an A," she said, encouraging me to trace the shape. "A," I repeated, "then B, then C." My heart brimmed with joy and astonishment. Within a few lessons I recognized simple words. Sophia Auld's face glowed with pride at how eagerly I learned. It was as if a door opened to a world beyond my reach, and I glimpsed wonders inside. Alas, that door was soon slammed shut. One day, Master Hugh came home and caught his wife teaching me the alphabet. He exploded with rage. "Sophia," he scolded, "what are you doing? It's unlawful and unsafe to teach a nigger to read." I was in the room, dusting the furniture quietly, but his words seared into my mind. I stood still as a mouse and listened. Master Hugh declared that education would spoil the best slave in the world. "If you teach that nigger how to read," he said, "there would be no keeping him. It would forever unfit him to be a slave. He would become unmanageable and of no value to his master. As to himself, it could do him no good, but a great deal of harm. It would make him discontented and unhappy." I remember my mistress's timid objections, but they were no match for his fervor. He forbid her from giving me another lesson. That was the end of my brief, sweet taste of formal education. Yet, paradoxically, Master Hugh's outburst was one of the greatest revelations of my life. These words sank deep into my heart, I later wrote, and called into existence an entirely new train of thought. In that moment, I realized why slaveholders so fiercely kept us illiterate. I now understood what had been to me a most perplexing difficulty: the white man's power to enslave the black man. Master Hugh had unintentionally given me the key to my escape: knowledge. I understood then that education and slavery were incompatible with each other. From that moment, I understood the pathway from slavery to freedom. Though Mistress Auld's kind tuition ended abruptly, my resolve to learn ignited like a bright flame. I continued my education in secret, as stealthily as a thief in the night. When Aaron sent me through the streets of Baltimore, I carried a Webster's spelling book hidden in my pocket. If I encountered poor white boys playing in the alley or sitting idle by the docks, I would befriend them. Many of them, hungry themselves, were easily tempted by bread. I'd save bits of bread from the Auld's kitchen and offer it to the neighborhood boys in exchange for lessons. "I'll give you this bread, and you give me some words," I'd say. They'd laugh and help me sound out letters and words. In this way, my tutors became a motley crew of urchins and street kids. Piece by piece, on street corners and wharves, I learned to read. I remember sitting by the harbor, the smell of brine in the breeze, laboring over a sentence while fishermen unloaded their catch. No whipping in the world could have stopped me from pursuing those precious words. Eventually, I moved on to writing. I observed the ship carpenters and noticed how they marked letters on timber for each part of a ship: L for larboard, S for starboard, etc. I'd sneak a piece of chalk and copy their letters on brick walls until I could shape all the letters of the alphabet. Bit by bit, in stolen moments, I acquired literacy. With reading came exposure to new ideas. I managed to get hold of an old book called The Columbian Orator, a collection of essays and dialogues on freedom, justice, and human rights. By the flicker of a candle late at night, I read tales of slaves standing up to masters, of debates defending liberty. Each page was nourishment to my starving mind. One dialogue in particular, where a slave argues against his master and wins his emancipation, struck me deeply. The seeds of rebellion were sown in my heart by those pages. As I read, my eyes were opened to the truth that I was not meant to be a slave, that I was equal to my masters in humanity, and that it was wrong for one man to wield such power over another. Along with this enlightenment came anguish. I often found myself overwhelmed by the realization of my wretched condition. Enslavement was no longer a vague misery. I understood fully what had been stolen from me. Sometimes I envied the ignorant, who felt content under the yoke. It opened my eyes to the horrible pit and revealed the teeth of the frightful dragons that waited to devour me. I wrote of learning to read. Knowledge brought sorrow as well as hope. There were days I walked along the wharf after reading a speech on human rights, and the injustice of my bondage hit me so hard I'd sink to a seat on a coil of rope, fighting back tears. I remember once watching the bustling harbor, bright sails in the distance, and feeling like my brain would burst with the weight of ideas and frustrations swirling within. But even in those darkest moments of despair, when I understood how trapped I was. I did not truly wish to unlearn what I had learned. The light hurt my eyes, but I could never go back to the darkness. Time passed. I grew from a boy into a teenager in Baltimore. My little charge, Tommy Auld, no longer needed minding, and I spent more time running errands and helping in Hugh Auld's shipyard. Around this time, our master, Thomas Auld, Hugh's brother, decided to reclaim me. Thomas was the one who technically owned me after the death of old Captain Anthony. He hadn't been a farmer before. He had become an owner by inheritance and was not respected by the slaves. Thomas Auld was a proud man with a hard soul. He hadn't fed or worked his slaves properly, and he and I had butted heads before. Once, I dared to let his horse run away so I could go find food at a neighbor's farm, as I was starving on his meager rations. Oh, he beat me for that cunning bit of defiance, but it only stiffened my will. In 1833, Master Thomas attended a Christian revival meeting and got religion. I naively hoped this would soften his heart. Instead, it armed him with sanctimonious cruelty. He found even more verses in the Bible to justify why he should whip us. I saw then a clear example of how the so-called Christianity of the slaveholder was often a hollow mockery of the real thing. Thomas Auld would emerge from church on Sunday with eyes aglow from the sermon about charity and meekness. And by Monday, he'd be cursing and lashing the black workers in his yard with renewed zeal. This hypocrisy would anger me more than anything. I realized that a slaveholder's religion was usually used as a tool of oppression, an excuse to be even more brutal, cloaked in self-righteousness. Later in life, I put it plainly. I love the pure, peaceable, and impartial Christianity of Christ. I therefore hate the corrupt, slave-holding, women-whipping, cradle-plundering, partial, and hypocritical Christianity of this land. Those were strong words, but they came from lived experience. Between a slave's Christianity, humble, loving, and the master's Christianity, cruel, hypocritical, there was, for me, the widest possible difference. But I digress. Let me return to 1833. I was about 15. Master Thomas decided I needed to be broken properly, since city life had apparently made me insolent. He rented me out to a man named Edward Covey for 1 year. Mr. Covey lived in the country, and his reputation struck fear in every slave's heart. They called him the slave breaker. He had a small farm and a great talent for shattering a person's will. I went to Covey's farm in January 1834. The cold was biting when I arrived. I recall blowing on my stiff fingers as I knocked on his door. Covey greeted me with a thin smile that did not reach his eyes. He was a wiry man, poor and cruel, known for his deceitful piety. He spoke with syrupy religiosity 1 minute and spewed curses the next. On the very first day, he set me to work as an oxen driver, something I'd never done. When I made a mistake with the oxen and they nearly wrecked a gate, Covey lashed me brutally. Thus began the darkest period of my youth. Covey worked me in the fields from dawn till dusk. He gave us little time to eat, little time to rest. He seemed to delight in surprise attacks. He would creep up behind in the fields and catch a slave who paused to wipe his brow, then whip them on the spot. I endured constant labor, plowing, hauling, chopping wood, in blistering heat and pouring rain. Covey whipped me roughly every week, sometimes more. The first 6 months with him, I doubt a single week passed without blood drawn on my back. With each beating, I felt a part of my spirit drain away. After a few months, Covey had succeeded in doing what I had thought impossible. He broke me. Mr. Covey succeeded in breaking me. I was broken in body, soul, and spirit. I would later admit, my natural vitality and cheerfulness were crushed out of me. I lost my spark. I stopped singing or even talking much. Covey had turned me into a crouching, silent slave, blinking obediently at his command. I would stumble back to the shed at night and collapse on the dirt floor, too exhausted to dream. I even lost my desire to read, the very thing that once brought me solace. Imagine. I had fought so hard to learn. Yet under Covey's terror, the disposition to read departed from me. On Sunday, our nominal day of rest, I was often too sore and tired to do anything but sleep. The bright visions that books and thoughts had given me dimmed into a haze. I felt as though the dark night of slavery closed in, and I became a brute in my own eyes. Perhaps the most painful loss was hope. I recall one hot Sunday afternoon. Covey had given us a rare pause. I sneaked off to the edge of the woods, where the Chesapeake Bay opened wide and blue. I sank down by the water, under the shade of some trees, and a flood of despair washed over me. I saw sailboats skimming across the bay, their white sails billowing gracefully. As I watched those distant ships, so free upon the waves, something in me cracked. Why was I doomed to live as a slave when those ships sailed free? The contrast was unbearable. Tears that I had held in for months finally burst forth. With no one to hear but the silent water, I cried out an apostrophe to the ships. "You are freedom's swift-winged angels that fly around the world," I sobbed, "while I am confined in bands of iron." The very sight of those vessels tortured me, for they symbolized the liberty I craved. Oh, that I were free! Oh, that I were on one of your gallant decks, under your protecting wing! I pleaded to the empty air. The gentle waves lapped at the shore, indifferent to my pain. "Go on, go on," I whispered to the ships. "Leave me behind if you must." In my fevered mind, I imagined the sails answering, beckoning me to follow. If I could swim, if I could fly, oh, why was I born a man, only to be made a brute? I pressed my forehead against the cool trunk of a tree, sobbing until I could sob no more. In that moment, I felt the lowest despair. I thought about ending my life, or ending Covey's, anything to escape the living death I was enduring. But then, just as quickly, a fierce determination rose in me. No, I thought, I will not die a slave. I will take any chance, risk any consequence, but I will be free. A flicker of rebellion sparked to life inside me once more. It was faint, but enough to keep me from sinking beneath those dark waters of the bay that day. The turning point of my life came shortly after. In August 1834, it had been 8 months under Covey's yoke. One sweltering afternoon, while I was fanning wheat in the barn loft, overcome by heat and fatigue, I collapsed. Covey saw me stop work and came striding with a rope, determined to whip me for shamming illness. As he tried to tie me up, something in me snapped. I had resolved I would never again be beaten if I could help it. When Covey seized my arm, I resisted. "No," I shouted, a word that had almost vanished from my vocabulary. I grabbed the rope from his hands. There, amid the floating chaff dust in that stifling barn, we grappled. Covey was taken aback that his normally docile slave fought back. But he was determined to break me anew. We struggled fiercely, knocking over threshing tools, both of us sweating and panting. He struck at me, and I managed to wrestle him to the ground. He called for help. One of his cousins ran in, but I kicked the man away, and he retreated in fear. For nearly 2 hours, Covey and I fought hand to hand. The barn was hot and dim, shafts of sunlight slanting through the cracks in the wall, illuminating the dust swirling around us as we scuffled. My heart was pounding not just with exertion, but with exhilaration. I was resisting. I was reclaiming myself. At last, Covey's strength waned, and he gave up. He stood there, disheveled and furious, but he knew better than to push further. To my surprise, he did not call the authorities or even demand punishment. Perhaps he was too proud to admit a 16-year-old boy had gotten the better of him. Or maybe he feared losing his reputation as an invincible breaker. Regardless, from that day forward, Covey never laid a hand on me again. I walked out of that barn a changed being. I felt alive, renewed, as if electric fire coursed through my veins. My blood-stained back healed, and along with it, my broken spirit was made whole. In my diary of the mind, I marked that day as the resurrection of my manhood. This battle with Mr. Covey was the turning point in my career as a slave. I later reflected. It rekindled the few expiring embers of freedom and revived within me a sense of my own manhood. Indeed, I felt the truth of those words deeply. When I walked outside after the fight, the colors of the world looked richer, the sky bluer, the green woods more vibrant. I remember the cicadas were humming in the trees as the sun dipped low, and I breathed in the humid air with a sense of triumph. I had stood up and defended myself like a man. Covey could beat me no more unless he killed me outright, and he knew it. My long-crushed spirit rose, I would write. Cowardice departed. Bold defiance took its place. And I now resolved that however long I might remain a slave in form, the day had passed forever when I could be a slave in fact. That night, as I lay on my pallet of straw in Covey's loft, every bruise on my body a badge of honor, I tasted a serene satisfaction. He only can understand the deep satisfaction I experienced who has himself repelled by force the bloody arm of slavery. I wrote. It was not revenge I felt, but resurgence. I quietly gave thanks in the darkness, my heart swelling with a newfound confidence. From that time on, I was never whipped again. Oh, I had a few more scuffles with other would-be tyrants in later years, but none could truly subdue me after that day. The remainder of my year with Covey passed without serious incident. He, nursing his pride, left me mostly alone. I suspect he considered having me publicly flogged as retaliation, but doing so would mean admitting I had fought him, damaging his feared reputation. So he swallowed his humiliation and called an uneasy truce. When my term with Covey ended, I was sent to another farmer for a short while, Mr. William Freeland, who, though a slaveholder, was by comparison a merciful and honest man. Under Freeland, I actually managed to do something daring and hopeful. I started a secret school. On Sundays, when we were not required to work, I gathered a handful of fellow slaves in a secluded woodshed. Using the Bible, for it was the only book many plantations had, I taught them to read. We risked much, for educating slaves was illegal. But these men were hungry to learn. How joyous I felt, seeing their eyes light up as letters became words, words became meaning. We were young and brave. We called each other brothers, and in that shed we tasted a sliver of intellectual freedom. Those Sundays were like an oasis in the desert of oppression. Sadly, it couldn't last. Local slave owners got wind of our little Sabbath school. One day they burst in on us, furious. They smashed our makeshift benches and scattered our books, threatening to whip everyone if we tried this outrage again. Thus ended our school, but not the bonds of brotherhood it forged among us. Indeed, it planted another idea in my mind, that we might escape together. By early 1836, I was about 18 and determined not to remain a slave for life. A few of my closest companions on Freeland's farm, Henry, John, and the two Henry Baileys, one was my uncle, felt the same. In the spring, we hatched an escape plan. It was bold and fraught with danger. We forged travel passes, pretending Master Freeland had given us permission to visit Baltimore over the Easter holiday. The idea was to canoe up the Chesapeake Bay, then trek north to free soil. I remember the nights we whispered of it in the dim light of a pine knot torch, our hearts pounding at the thought of liberty. We vowed not to breathe a word to anyone else. On the morning of the planned escape, just as the sun was rising and mist lay over the fields, we were about to make our move when suddenly we were betrayed. It's likely another slave, fearful or seeking favor, had informed the masters. Before we could even run for the woods, a group of armed white men swarmed in and seized us. They tied our hands. I had secretly brought a little penknife, intending to use it to destroy our written passes if we were caught. In the scuffle, I managed to shred mine to bits and swallow the paper, so no incriminating evidence remained. Nonetheless, we were dragged off to the county jail in Easton. There, in a cold stone cell, I spent several anxious weeks. The others were interrogated, and eventually, through some intervention or sale, they were released back to farms or sold further south. I feared deeply that I would be sold to the dreaded plantations of the Deep South as punishment, effectively a death sentence of misery. Each day in that damp jail, I pressed my ear to the tiny window, listening for any scrap of news about my fate. One afternoon, the jailer unlocked my cell and led me out. My master, Thomas Auld, had come. He looked displeased, but also oddly relieved. He decided not to send me to the Deep South. Perhaps he couldn't get a good price for me on short notice, or perhaps some guilt tugged at him. Instead, he sent me back to Baltimore, to his brother Hugh. Back to the city I went. Older, harder, yet unbroken. I think Master Thomas simply didn't want the trouble of me anymore and figured I'd fetch more value as a trained ship caulker in Baltimore than as a plantation hand in Georgia. Thus, in 1836, I returned to Baltimore and lived again under Hugh and Sophia Auld. 2 years had passed since I'd left them, and in that time Sophia's demeanor had changed. She was no longer the tender angel who first taught me the alphabet. Under the influence of slavery, she had become colder, suspicious of my reading, quick to scold where once she smiled. I mourned the loss of her former self. Slavery's corruption poisoned all, even the kind-hearted. Hugh Auld apprenticed me to a shipbuilder to learn the trade of caulking ships. I was entering young manhood, broad-shouldered from farm labor, more knowledgeable of the world, and carrying scars outside and in. At the shipyard, I faced hostility from white apprentices who resented a black youth learning the craft. One day a gang of them attacked me viciously, knocking me down with hammers and hitting me in the eye with a brick. I was nearly blinded in one eye. I stumbled home with my face bloodied. To his credit, Hugh was outraged enough to take me to a justice of the peace to complain, but predictably, no white magistrate would charge white apprentices for assaulting a black. Though I healed, I learned that even in a liberal city, a black man had no legal recourse against white violence. Still, I persevered in the trade. In time, I became a skilled caulker, earning good wages for my work, though the wages passed directly from the shipyard into Master Hugh's pocket, with only a scant fraction sometimes given to me. I recall the bitter sting of receiving my first substantial pay, and then watching Hugh take it all, as if it were naturally his. This was the arrangement under slavery. Our labor, even in a city, enriched others while we remained paupers. By 1838, I was about 20 years old and tired of living under others' thumbs. The dream of escape had not died in me. It had only grown more insistent. I began devising my own solo plan for freedom. Unlike on the Eastern Shore, in the city I had a bit more mobility. I made contacts among free black sailors and obtained crucial information about travel routes. Importantly, I fell in love. Her name was Anna Murray, a free black woman living in Baltimore. Anna was a few years older, industrious, and kind. She had a warm smile that steadied my nerves. We met through mutual friends at a gathering, and soon a deep affection blossomed between us. Anna believed in me fiercely. When I confided my escape plan to her, she not only approved, she actively helped. Love is a powerful motivator. We wanted to be together as free people, and she was ready to risk everything to make it so. With Anna's savings and support, I prepared for the most important journey of my life. I procured a sailor's uniform, a red shirt and a tarpaulin hat, with a black scarf tied loosely around my neck. This was to be my disguise. Many black sailors worked the Chesapeake Bay, and a naval uniform would provide cover. I also managed to borrow free papers from a brave free black seaman. These papers, which I carried carefully in my pocket, testified falsely that I was a free man. My heart raced in the days leading up to the attempt. Every knock on the door made me jump. Every casual glance from a white clerk on the street made my palms sweat. If caught, I would face dire punishment, possibly sold to the deep South, never to see Anna again. But I was resolute. I remember the night before my escape. I scarcely slept at all. Anna came to see me secretly. We sat together in a small attic room, a single candle between us, casting trembling light on our faces. She pressed a little money into my hand, all she could spare, and we prayed together in the stillness. She told me she had faith God would see me through. With tears in her eyes, she whispered, "I'll meet you up north." I nodded, afraid to speak lest I break down. In the early dawn hours of September 3rd, 1838, I embarked on my flight. Dressed in my sailor's garb, carrying a sailor's protection pass and a nervous but determined expression, I boarded a northbound train. A kindly black porter gave me a tip to sit near the back and look confident. The train puffed out of Baltimore. Each chug of the engine was like a thunderclap in my chest. At any moment, I feared an agent might demand, "Your papers," or someone would recognize me. My whole future hung by a thread, and that thread ran through this journey. At the first stop, a white ticket master did come through. My heart nearly stopped when he scrutinized me. I handed him the seaman's papers with a steady hand and held my breath. He looked me over. A black sailor traveling alone was not unheard of, but any slight misstep could arouse suspicion. Time itself seemed to pause as he examined the documents by the window light. Outside, I could see the greenery flashing by, each mile taking me closer to freedom. After an eternity of a few seconds, the man handed back the paper and moved on. I exhaled silently, hardly believing I was safe. As the train continued, I dared to gaze out at the countryside flying past. Maryland's fields and rivers, which I'd known under the yoke, now slipped behind me. In a few hours, we approached Wilmington, Delaware, the last stop before free Pennsylvania. Oh, how my hands trembled and sweat slicked my brow as we crossed into the free state. By afternoon, the train rolled into Philadelphia. I stepped onto the platform and for the first time set foot on free soil. Yet I did not feel entirely free. I was still within reach of slave catchers, even in Philadelphia. I continued on, boarding a steam ferry across the Delaware River and then a train to New York City. Late one night, under the gaslights of Manhattan, I arrived exhausted and overwhelmed. I was free, yes, but I was alone, penniless, and in a city thick with danger for fugitives. Anyone could be a bounty hunter, and the laws offered me no protection. Every sound in the boarding house where I hid that first night made me start. I barricaded the door and lay on the bed fully clothed. My feelings were a mix of elation and terror. In a letter soon after, I described it thus: I felt as one might feel upon escape from a den of hungry lions. I was relieved beyond measure to have slipped out of the lion's den. But I knew those lions, the slave catchers, still prowled not far behind, sniffing for my scent. In New York, I was fortunate to encounter the Underground Railroad network of abolitionists. A brave black gentleman named David Ruggles took me in. Mr. Ruggles was a well-known anti-slavery activist in the city, and he harbored many a runaway in his time. In the flickering light of his small parlor, he congratulated me on my bold escape and gave me practical advice. The first thing he asked was, "Do you have a safe destination?" I told him about a friend's suggestion of New Bedford, Massachusetts, a whaling town known to welcome fugitives. He agreed that New Bedford would be a good choice, far from the Maryland borders and full of Quakers and abolitionists. He arranged for me to continue onward. But first, I had urgent personal business. My beloved Anna was on her way. I sent word to her secretly, and within days she arrived in New York, having traveled alone by train and coach, a courageous act for a young free black woman. When I saw her, we embraced tightly, both of us weeping tears of joy and relief. In the secure company of Mr. Ruggles, Anna and I were married on September 15th, 1838. It was a simple ceremony performed by Reverend James Pennington, a former slave himself. I had no ring to give her, no finery, just my everlasting devotion and a promise that she would not regret coming north to be my wife. Anna's faith in me was like a beacon. With her by my side, I felt twice as strong. A new chapter of my life was beginning, one of freedom and partnership. From New York, we traveled to New Bedford, Massachusetts, aided by the Underground Railroad friends. We arrived in New Bedford in the late fall of 1838. Nathan and Mary Johnson, a kindly black couple there, took us in for a few days and helped us get settled. They were the sort of people who practiced true Christian charity, opening their home to penniless newcomers simply out of goodwill. I'll never forget sitting at their supper table my first evening in New Bedford, eating a hot bowl of chowder and feeling, for the first time, safe. The town itself astonished me. I'd carried with me the Southern prejudice that without slaves, the North must be a poor, rough place. How wrong I was. As I walked the streets of New Bedford, I was disappointed, in the most delightful way, by the appearance of wealth and comfort around me. I saw solid stone warehouses filled with goods, fine merchant ships in the harbor, well-kept cottages, and even opulent homes. There was a hush of industry. People labored diligently, but without the noisy oaths and whip cracks that punctuated labor in the South. No one was driving anyone with violence. I saw no whipping of men, but all seemed to go smoothly on, I observed. Every man I saw in New Bedford, black or white, seemed to work with a sense of dignity, as if he knew he earned his day's bread and respected himself for it. This was a revelation to me. I realized that free labor was not only more honorable, it was more productive and civilized. The very ships I saw, whaling vessels, made fortunes without a single slave. The whole atmosphere hummed with a quiet prosperity born of freedom. On an afternoon stroll, I marveled at splendid churches, beautiful dwellings, and neatly cultivated gardens. In all my life in Maryland, I'd never seen such a concentration of refinement and wealth. And here it was accomplished without slaves. It struck me powerfully that slavery was not the source of civilization, as Southern propagandists claimed, but rather an impediment to it. New Bedford's example stood as living proof that a society could flourish in peace and productivity without shackling others. In New Bedford, I also encountered something equally uplifting: respect. The first Sunday we attended service at a black church, I was astounded to see black men and women, well-dressed and confident, participating freely, without cowering. They were addressed as Mr. and Mrs., looked upon as regular members of the community, not as subordinates. I remember how emotional I felt that first Sunday, hearing the congregation sing a hymn, Amazing Grace, and realizing I was singing as a free man among free people. It felt like I had crossed the Jordan into the Promised Land. In the initial days, I had to choose a new name. I was done being called Fred Bailey, the surname I'd used in Maryland. Too many hunters might be searching for that name. Our host, Mr. Johnson, asked what I wished to be called. I told him Frederick must remain. It was all I had left from my mother. For a surname, he suggested Douglass, inspired by a noble character in Sir Walter Scott's poem, The Lady of the Lake. I liked the sound of it, and thus I became Frederick Douglass, a new name for my new life. Anna and I settled into a humble lodging. Those early months in New Bedford were not without struggles. Prejudice was not entirely absent, and I faced difficulty finding skilled work due to hostility from white caulkers who refused to work alongside black men. So I took whatever honest work I could. I sawed wood, shoveled coal, worked as a handyman. Any job to keep food on our table, I did with a glad heart because I knew I was working for ourselves, not for a master. In the evenings, by lamplight, I voraciously read Northern newspapers, especially The Liberator, published by William Lloyd Garrison, the famous abolitionist. I had heard of Garrison back in Maryland when I secretly read the papers, and now I devoured each Liberator issue like a feast. Garrison's fiery denunciations of slavery resonated with every fiber of my being. His words were bold and uncompromising. Immediate emancipation, no compromise with the evil of slavery. Reading them, I felt as if someone was finally speaking the moral truth I knew. In 1839, our family grew. Anna and I welcomed the first of our children. We would eventually have 5. Holding my infant son in my arms, I often thought of my own mother and how she must have felt holding me. I silently vowed that my children would never know the life of slaves. They would grow up free and educated. That thought gave me immense comfort and motivation. I became involved with the small black community in New Bedford and started to attend abolitionist meetings. I was mostly a listener at first, absorbing the ideas and rhetoric. Many white abolitionists in Massachusetts were Garrisonians, followers of Garrison's nonviolent moral suasion principles. They didn't yet know who I was when I sat quietly in the back. But a moment arrived that thrust me onto the public stage quite unexpectedly. In August 1841, an anti-slavery convention was held on the island of Nantucket. I managed to attend my first big abolitionist gathering. The hall was filled with fervent activists, black and white, passionately discussing how to abolish slavery. I remember I sat on a bench, trying to remain inconspicuous. I was only 3 years out of bondage and felt somewhat shy among these seasoned reformers. But fate wouldn't let me stay silent. A gentleman named William C. Coffin, who knew of my background, urged me to speak to the assembly about my experiences. At first I refused, my heart pounding. I had never addressed a large crowd before, and certainly not such an illustrious one. But others chimed in, encouraging, "Let Frederick speak." With shaking knees, I rose. The room fell quiet, all eyes on this unknown young black man about to tell his story. My voice quavered initially. I managed to say, I was born a slave in Maryland. And from there, memories and emotions surged. I spoke of my childhood, of Aunt Hester's beating, of learning to read and understanding the chains that bound my people. As I continued, I forgot my fear. The words poured out, raw and honest. Gasps and cries of sympathy arose at points. Many wept openly to hear a first-hand account of slavery's cruelty. When I finished, the hall was completely still for a beat, then erupted in thunderous applause. One of those applauding was William Lloyd Garrison himself. He leapt to his feet and exclaimed that I was living proof of the intellectual capacity and dignity of the colored man. Garrison's own speech in response to mine was, by all accounts, a thing of eloquence and power. He praised my courage in speaking and called on the audience to dedicate themselves anew to ending slavery. That day marked the beginning of my public career. The Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society offered me a position as a traveling speaker to share my story across the North. I was reluctant at first. I had not been quite 3 years out of slavery, I told them. I distrust my ability. Besides, speaking openly put me at risk of being identified and captured under the fugitive slave laws. But the cause of freedom tugged at me, and friends like Garrison and Wendell Phillips insisted I had a powerful voice that could awaken the conscience of the nation. After some soul-searching, I agreed to try it for a few months. Those few months turned into a 14-year odyssey as an abolitionist lecturer and writer. I traveled from town to town, often with white fellow abolitionists, speaking in churches, barns, town squares. anywhere people would gather to listen. In the beginning, my knees often knocked from nervousness. I was a young man, self-educated, and sometimes faced hostile crowds who heckled me, not believing a person of my background could speak with such clarity. Indeed, many doubted I had ever been a slave at all, since I spoke so passionately and, in their eyes, so well. I remember once, after I related the horrors of slavery to a New England village audience, a murmur went through the white part of the crowd. "This fellow is too articulate. He must be an impostor, or perhaps never a slave." They found it hard to reconcile the dignity and reasoning I presented with their prejudiced notion that a slave was akin to an animal. These doubts actually propelled me toward authorship. To silence skeptics and to further the cause with undeniable truth, I decided to write down the story of my life. In 1845, with the help of abolitionist friends, I published Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave. I laid bare names, places, and events, the very details that could identify me to my legal owner, Thomas Auld. It was a risk, but one I felt compelled to take. The narrative was my truth, offered as a weapon against the lies of slavery. It sold thousands of copies, far beyond our expectations. And suddenly, I found myself famous in abolitionist circles, both in America and abroad. However, fame was a double-edged sword. It meant it was now dangerous for me to remain in the United States. My former master would surely hear of the book. It even reached back to Talbot County, I later learned. Under the law, he could demand my return. And with the Fugitive Slave Act's shadow already looming, my freedom in the North became precarious. So in the autumn of 1845, I set sail for Britain and Ireland. Ah, the voyage to Europe. How extraordinary it felt for an ex-slave to cross the Atlantic as a free man. I boarded a ship in Boston, and as it cut through the waves, I often stood on deck at night, inhaling the salty air. The ocean stretched out in serene moonlit ripples, and I reflected that I was perhaps the first of my enslaved family to see this vast sea and approach a foreign shore by choice. Landing in Liverpool, England was like entering a dream. I was beyond the reach of America's oppressive laws. The weight of constant fear lifted from my shoulders. Though I confess, it took weeks before I truly believed no slave catcher could touch me there. From Liverpool, I traveled to Ireland, arriving in Dublin in August 1845. Ireland at that time was at the onset of the Great Famine, a land of deep suffering. Yet I was welcomed with overwhelming warmth. The Irish people, themselves long oppressed under colonial rule, showed a spontaneous solidarity with me. In Dublin, Cork, Limerick, Belfast, and other cities, I spoke to crowds about the horrors of slavery in America. To my amazement, the halls were packed, and I was treated with a respect I had never experienced among white society. One night in Dublin, after a rousing meeting, some local gentleman invited me to a tavern. We sat together sharing stories over ale, and I suddenly realized no one was looking at me as though I were inferior or out of place. They laughed at my jokes, slapped my back in camaraderie. I felt, for the first time in my life, truly like a man among men, not a color among whites. As I wrote to a friend, I find myself not treated as a color, but as a man. That revelation was both joyful and heartbreaking. Joyful to be seen as an equal soul, and heartbreaking to know how profoundly my own country denied me this basic dignity. In Ireland, I met the great Daniel O'Connell, the liberator who fought for Catholic emancipation and fiercely denounced American slavery. How my heart swelled to hear O'Connell thunder, "My spirit is at home wherever the miserable are to be succored or the slave set free." When I was introduced to him at a rally, I could barely speak for reverence. I managed to tell the crowd that on the Carolina plantations, slaves spoke O'Connell's name with hope, that we wished for a black O'Connell to rise among us. O'Connell embraced me and called me his black son. This bond across race and nation fortified my sense that the struggle for liberty was universal. In England and Scotland, too, I was greeted as an equal and a brother. I spoke in London, Newcastle, Edinburgh, and Glasgow, among other places, and many good souls rallied to support my cause. There were kind ladies and gentlemen, like the Richardsons of Newcastle, whose hearts were so moved that they decided to secure my permanent freedom. Without my asking, a group of British supporters raised money, more than £150 sterling, a large sum, and contacted my master in America. In 1846, they negotiated the purchase of my legal liberty. When they first told me of this plan, I confess I had mixed feelings. The notion of being bought out of bondage felt degrading. I was a man, not a horse, to be traded. But the reality was that without that transaction, I'd always live under the threat of being made property again should I return to the States. So I consented. The papers were signed in due course. I was now formally and forever a free man. How shall I describe the moment I received the document affirming my emancipation? It was in London, in a modest flat by candlelight. I read it, and tears blurred the words. I was free not only in fact, which I had been since I stepped foot in the North, but in law. No hunter could ever again claim me as someone's chattel. The relief and gratitude I felt toward those benefactors is something I can hardly put into words. They did not have to do what they did. They were people of another country entirely, owing me nothing. But in their righteousness and Christian compassion, they took up my burden. They gave me the gift that America would not, the recognition of my full personhood under the law. During those 2 years abroad, I experienced some of the happiest days of my life. I could stroll the streets, ride in coaches, eat in restaurants. And never once was I told, "You can't because you are black." I remember attending a dinner in London with a diverse company of activists and feeling utterly at ease. One gentle English lady remarked how well-spoken and gentlemanly I was. That word, gentleman, startled me. I had been called many things in America, but never that. It felt good. It felt normal. It felt like how life should be. On a sentimental note, I was also touched by the landscapes and culture I encountered. The rolling green of the Irish hills, the bustling pride of Manchester's working class, the ancient castles of Scotland, the stately halls of London. I drank it all in. I visited factories to see workers' conditions and found, despite poverty, a certain freedom in their carriage that enslaved labor could never emulate. In Belfast, I saw shipyards where Irish and English workers toiled side by side. I was reminded of my own days in the Baltimore yards and how race had divided us there. Here, class differences still existed, but I noticed a certain camaraderie possible among free laborers that slavery precluded entirely. By 1847, though, I felt the call to return home. Britain had shown me humanity, but my people were still in chains across the ocean. With the money I earned on lecture tours and generous contributions from English friends, I returned to the United States, determined to continue the fight for emancipation. I brought with me funds to start a newspaper of my own, though it was hard to leave the safety and respect of Europe. I knew my mission lay in the land of my birth. Anna was waiting for me, and our little family needed me as well. Settling in Rochester, New York, I launched my newspaper, which I titled The North Star, in December 1847. The name was symbolic. Escaping slaves navigated by the North Star in the night sky, following it to freedom. I wanted my paper to be a guiding light as well, pointing the way to liberation for those still enslaved and advocating for the rights of Black Americans generally. On the masthead of the North Star, I printed our motto: "Right is of no sex, truth is of no color. God is the Father of us all, and we are all brethren." These words proclaimed our belief in the equality of all people, regardless of gender or race. It was important to me to include women's rights in that motto, for I had become convinced that the fight for our freedom was intertwined with the fight for the rights of women. My wife Anna was a strong woman who had played a critical role in my own journey, and over the years I had met remarkable women in the abolitionist movement, black and white, whose talents were equal to any man's. So, the North Star stood for a broad human freedom. Running a newspaper was no easy task. I had to learn quickly the arts of editing, typesetting, and financing a publication. I recall many late nights in our Rochester printing office, the gaslight burning low as I set type with ink-stained fingers until the dawn. Rochester, with its swift Genesee River and flour mills, was a hotbed of reform movements and a terminus of the Underground Railroad. It proved a good home for my family and our cause. We even sheltered fleeing slaves in our own home. Our basement became a station where many a trembling soul, fresh from crossing the Niagara River, would rest and be fed by Anna before moving on to Canada. Life was full and purposeful. During these years, I grew as a thinker and sometimes differed with my old mentor Garrison on strategy. Garrison believed the U.S. Constitution was a pro-slavery document and that moral persuasion and non-involvement in politics were the way. After studying the Constitution for myself and engaging with other abolitionists like Gerrit Smith, I came to a different conclusion. I saw the Constitution as a potentially anti-slavery document, if interpreted correctly. And I believed political action, like voting and forming anti-slavery parties, was necessary. This led to a respectful parting of ways between me and Garrison's camp around 1851. But despite any differences in approach, our ultimate goal was the same: the end of slavery. In Rochester, I forged friendships with other key figures. One such figure was John Brown. I met Brown first in the late 1840s, and he impressed me as a man of intense moral fire. Here was a white man who did not condescend. He looked me in the eye as equal and spoke of his plan to end slavery through armed insurrection. Brown believed God had appointed him to break the chains by force. I admired his zeal, and we became good friends. Though even early on I doubted the practicality of some of his militant schemes. He visited my home, my children played on his knee. Father Brown, they called him affectionately. We stayed up late into the night discussing strategy. Brown had a very specific plan. He wanted to ignite a slave uprising by establishing a mountain stronghold along the Appalachian Range, starting in Virginia. From there, he would lead raids to free slaves, who would then join his army, and gradually this would destabilize slavery. I was sympathetic but cautious. I said to him, "Friend Brown, I am ever ready to write, speak, publish, or even conspire against slavery when there's hope of success. But your plan, it might be a steel trap." He was not deterred. Our friendship was tested in 1859, when John Brown was ready to execute his plan with an assault on the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. He came to me in August and urged me to join him. We met secretly in an old stone quarry in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. The summer night was thick with humidity. Frogs croaked in the distance as we spoke in low tones. Brown outlined his final preparations, and he pleaded for my help. Particularly, he thought my presence would rally the slaves to his side once he began. I loved the man for his commitment, but I strongly believed he was charging into disaster. I told him frankly, "You are walking into a perfect steel trap. Harper's Ferry is a federal arsenal. The moment you seize it, the government will crush you." He listened gravely, but his eyes burned with conviction. He responded that if I came along, I could help avoid bloodshed by persuading more slaves to run rather than fight. He even promised to protect me with his life if need be. But my mind was made. Brown's plan, I felt, was suicide. It would not spark the slave uprising he imagined, and might instead set back our cause by inciting a furious backlash. Painfully, I declined to participate. That parting was somber. He was disappointed, though not angry. I clasped his hand and said, "I respect you, Captain Brown, but I cannot see this ending well. I pray God protect you." It was the last time I saw him alive. In October 1859, Brown led his small band and did indeed capture Harper's Ferry for a brief time, hoping to trigger a revolt. The revolt did not happen. U.S. Marines, under Robert E. Lee, stormed in and Brown was wounded and captured. In the aftermath, a panic gripped the South, and they looked for conspirators everywhere. My name was soon linked, since I had known Brown. Fearing arrest and worse, I fled to Canada and then back to England for a few months. From abroad, I anxiously followed the news. Brown was tried for treason in Virginia. On the day of his execution, I wept. I thought of his wife and family, and I thought of the courageous old man mounting the scaffold for the sake of my people. To me, John Brown became a martyr, a saint of sorts. I later said, if John Brown did not end the war that ended slavery, he at least began the war that ended slavery. And indeed, his raid further electrified the national debate. Brown's actions made the divide between North and South even starker, and some say it lit the fuse of the coming Civil War. I returned to America as that great conflict, the Civil War, loomed on the horizon. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president, and Southern states began seceding rather than accept even the mild threat Lincoln posed to slavery. By April 1861, war erupted when Confederates fired on Fort Sumter. I threw my energies behind the Union cause, but I was impatient. In my speeches and editorials, I pushed the federal government to declare that the war's aim must be the abolition of slavery, not merely the preservation of the Union. Initially, Lincoln moved cautiously, but as the war dragged on, he evolved. By 1862, he announced the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, and it took effect in January 1863, freeing slaves in rebellious states, at least on paper. What a jubilant day that was for us. Bells rang out in many northern towns. We held church services of thanksgiving. Yet I knew the struggle was far from over. One of my focuses during the war was the treatment of black soldiers. After emancipation, the Union began recruiting African American men for the Army. I helped in those efforts, even personally raising 2 companies of the 54th Massachusetts Regiment. My own sons, Louis and Charles, were among the first volunteers, eager to fight for the freedom of their brothers still in bondage. However, we encountered injustice, even in the Union ranks. Black soldiers were initially paid only half the wage of white soldiers and were often given poor equipment. I was incensed. These men risked their lives just the same. Many gave the ultimate sacrifice, as tragically did my friend's son at Fort Wagner. In the summer of 1863, I went to Washington, D.C. to meet President Abraham Lincoln and advocate for equal pay and protection of black troops. Allow me to share a vivid recollection of my first meeting with Lincoln, because it was remarkable in how I was received. I arrived at the White House on a hot August day, unsure if I would even get in. The waiting room was full of petitioners, mostly white, eyeing me with curiosity and some scorn. I handed my card to the doorman, who took it into the office. To my surprise, in a matter of minutes, I was ushered through the door. As I entered, I saw President Lincoln rising from his chair to greet me. "Mr. Douglass, I know you. I have read about you," he said, extending his hand. I was taken aback by his genuine warmth. He, the president, stood up to shake my hand, something no white man of his stature had ever done for me. Lincoln was tall, he towered over me, with a plain, kind face etched by the burdens of war. He motioned for me to sit. He received me just as a gentleman receives another gentleman, with a kind cordiality and a respectful reserve. In that moment, I felt an unexpected ease. Later I quipped to friends, "I tell you, I felt big there." Indeed, in that office, for the first time in my life, I did not feel like a black man in a white world. I felt simply like an American citizen meeting the leader of my country. We discussed the issues earnestly. I pressed him on unequal pay and the treatment of colored prisoners of war. The Confederacy was murdering or enslaving black Union soldiers rather than treating them as POWs. Lincoln listened thoughtfully. He explained some political constraints, but he affirmed his commitment to our cause. "The colored man's enlistment is needed," he said, "and I will do my best to secure justice for them." I left that meeting with a mixture of admiration and relief. To be sure, Lincoln was not a perfect abolitionist. He was a pragmatist, and I sometimes criticized him in my editorials for being slow or wavering. But after speaking with him, I understood he had a broad view and a burden of saving an entire nation. I have often been asked my impression of him. I can say, he was the first great white man I talked with in the United States who did not remind me of the difference between himself and myself, of the difference of color. He treated me as a man, and that speaks volumes about his character. Over time, my respect for Lincoln grew, especially after he issued the Emancipation Proclamation and advocated the 13th Amendment to abolish slavery fully. I would later call him emphatically the black man's president in terms of his impact, even as I acknowledged he was, by heritage, the white man's president. The Civil War ended in 1865 with the Union's victory and the collapse of the Confederacy. How can I describe the joy among our people when slavery was formally abolished by law? It was like the dawn of a new world. I had lived to see the evil system I was born under destroyed. I attended celebrations and church services where old freedwomen shouted praises to the heavens and young men and women danced for a future unchained. I delivered a speech in 1865 titled "What the Black Man Wants," in which I insisted that our responsibility now was to secure full citizenship. Slavery is not abolished until the black man has the ballot, I declared. At a meeting of the Anti-Slavery Society just after the war, I thundered, "Do nothing with us. Your doing with us has already played mischief with us. If the Negro cannot stand on his own legs, let him fall. All I ask is, give him a chance to stand on his own legs." Those words drew applause from allies and unease from those who favored a slower approach. But I meant them. We didn't want handouts or special treatment, just justice and equal rights. We wanted the same chance to pursue happiness as any other American. We wanted to vote, to learn, to work, to live where we pleased, to raise our families in safety, just to be. The period after the war, known as Reconstruction, was one of high hopes and harsh challenges. I was appointed to several important roles during this era. In 1872, I moved to Washington, D.C., and shortly thereafter, I became president of the Freedmen's Savings Bank, an institution meant to help former slaves, which unfortunately was already tottering when I took it over. It collapsed in 1874 to my deep regret. I was also appointed U.S. Marshal of the District of Columbia in 1877, and later the Recorder of Deeds for D.C. I was proud to hold these offices. It felt like vindication that a black man could serve in the nation's capital in such capacities. Yet I never deluded myself that equality had arrived in full. In many parts of the South, old masters regained power as Reconstruction waned. The North's political will to enforce black rights faltered by the late 1870s. I remember feeling a chill of foreboding when federal troops were withdrawn in 1877 as part of a political compromise. It was as if the guardians had left the gate, and the wolves began to circle. Sure enough, new forms of oppression emerged. Black codes, sharecropping systems, intimidation by groups like the Ku Klux Klan. Our hard-won rights were under assault. I spoke out tirelessly against these injustices. I toured the country giving lectures about the importance of the ballot and about the wrongs being done in the South. There was backlash. In some places I was greeted with hostility, even in the North, as racist ideas did not vanish overnight. But I pressed on, as was my duty. I also continued to speak for women's rights, aligning myself with suffragists like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. I had been the lone male voice at the Seneca Falls Convention back in 1848 supporting women's suffrage, and I held to that principle throughout my life. I used to say, I would gladly hold the door open and see my daughters or wife or any woman walk in and exercise the rights of citizenship. Some male abolitionists abandoned the women's cause after the war, feeling it was a distraction. But I believed justice is not a finite commodity. Extending it to one group does not require limiting it to another. In my later years, I was often asked to reflect on the journey of our people. I saw so much change. From the time I was that little boy sleeping on the dirt floor by my grandmother's hearth, to now, an old man sitting at a desk in a study filled with books, invited to dine with presidents and prime ministers. The arc of my life traced the arc of a nation's awakening. But the work was far from finished. The post-slavery generations faced new challenges: segregation, disenfranchisement, economic hardship. But I had faith that with determination and unity, they could overcome. If there is no struggle, there is no progress, I had said back in 1857, and it remained true. Freedom is not a static gift, but a living, growing thing that each generation must nurture and defend. One bright memory near my life's close was in 1888, when I attended the Republican National Convention. There was talk of nominating me for vice president, largely symbolic. But to have a black man's name even considered at such a level was astounding compared to where we'd started. Also, I remarried in 1884 after Anna, my dear wife of over 4 decades, passed away. My second wife, Helen Pitts Douglass, was a white woman from New York. Our interracial marriage scandalized some, including friends and even my children at first. But Helen was a remarkable woman, educated, kind, and courageous in her convictions. With her, I enjoyed companionship in my twilight years. We would often sit in the parlor of our home in Washington, a house called Cedar Hill, and discuss history, politics, and philosophy. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, I'd take out my violin. I had taught myself to play a bit, and draw a bow across it, filling the room with a gentle melody while the sun set over the Anacostia River below our hill. Those were peaceful times, a contrast to the storms of my youth. On a winter day in February 1895, I attended a meeting of the National Council of Women in Washington. I was aging, nearly 77, but still vigorous and passionate about causes. I spoke there, encouraging unity between black and white women activists and reminding them that the cause of equal rights was shared by all. That evening, back at Cedar Hill, after recounting to Helen the day's events, I felt a sudden pain in my chest. I sank into a chair as darkness engulfed me. I passed from this life quickly and mercifully, without prolonged suffering. But let me now, in this narrative for you, step aside from the moment of death, since I promised a gentle journey, not a jarring end. Instead, envision with me a serene scene. It is the evening of a long, full life. Picture an older Frederick Douglass walking in the garden of his home at twilight. The air is mild, the sky streaked with pink and gold. He leans on a cane carved from an old oak, each step deliberate. He pauses by a rose bush, its winter thorns bare but promising blooms in due time. There is a far-off look in his eye as he watches the last light fade. What thoughts cross his mind? Perhaps he is thinking of that boy on the Maryland plantation, once so helpless. Perhaps he's thinking of his mother's face, or of Aunt Hester's cries, or of the first time he tasted freedom's air in New York. Maybe he hears the echo of the ships on Chesapeake Bay in his memory. And he smiles, because he eventually sailed on bigger ships across the ocean as a respected man. He might recall standing in that barn fighting Covey, or standing before crowds of thousands in London's Exeter Hall. All those moments bitter and sweet, like threads woven into one rich tapestry of a life. I, speaking as that man, can tell you I have more gratitude than regrets. Yes, I saw the worst of humanity's cruelty, but I also saw the triumph of goodness and perseverance. I saw people of all races come together to fight for what is right. I witnessed the shackles fall and a new sun rise for my people. There were setbacks, and there will be more, but I remain hopeful. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice, as one of my fellow abolitionists famously said. I believe that. I have lived that. Now, dear friend, the night has grown late. The crickets are softly chirping outside, and a cool breeze may be touching your cheek through an open window. I hope my story, with its trials and its triumphs, has not disturbed your rest, but rather gently carried you along, like a calm river carries a boat under the moonlight. Think of the journey we have taken together. From a dim cabin where a little boy wondered why he was a slave, to the halls of power and across the oceans. From the darkest injustices to bright notes of freedom. It has been a long journey, over 70 years, and now this old traveler grows tired and content. As you drift into slumber, take comfort in the thought that even out of the deepest suffering, a soul can rise. The story of my life is, I hope, a testimony to the capacity of the human spirit to overcome. If there is no struggle, there is no progress, I learned. And progress did come. Slavery was abolished. Millions were lifted from bondage. And those struggles continued. Each generation would carry the torch a little further toward that ideal of a more perfect union where liberty and justice are truly for all. I will leave you with one final image. Imagine a clear night sky filled with stars. One of those stars is the North Star, gleaming steady and true in the north, the same star that guided me when I escaped, that symbolized hope in my newspaper's name, that shines as a reminder that no matter how dark the night, there is always a light to guide you. Let that North Star watch over you tonight. In your sleep, may your dreams be free and your spirit at peace. Thank you for listening to my story. Rest now in the knowledge that dawn always comes, and with each dawn, new freedom, new hope. Good night, and God bless.